Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Forever Wisdom. In today's video, we're going to go over 5 key takeaways from the emotion code, how to release your trapped emotions for abundant health, love, and happiness by Dr. Bradley Nelson. Now, this book wasn't necessarily on my radar screen, but I did read a book from an author a few weeks back that I like, know, and trust, and he referenced the emotion code a handful of times, so it snuck on my reading list. I couldn't resist. So glad I had an opportunity to read this over the last week. So let's dive right in. Takeaway number 1 is that everyone has trapped emotions. So Dr. Nelson suggests that an emotion becomes trapped somewhere in our bodies when, while we're processing a normal emotion, somewhere along the way we get interrupted. That normal processing becomes interrupted for some reason or another. And when we have a trapped emotion, we're more susceptible to experiencing intense degrees of that emotion and experiencing it more often, and ultimately attracting it into our lives. So for example, if you know anyone who gets angry or angrier than most people with some of the little things that don't necessarily anger you or other people, but this one person, man, you know, something about it, something about them, they just tend to get angrier than most. Well, Dr. Nelson suggests that potentially they may have a trapped emotion. So how do we release these trapped emotions? Well, that's what the emotion code is all about. And I won't spoil anything here, but Dr. Nelson does a really nice job of delivering a step-by-step framework that can help us as the reader release our trapped emotions and help others around us to do the same as well. It's one of the reasons I appreciate this book and I appreciate Dr. Nelson so much is that you could really tell that he comes from a place of abundance, giving, and contribution. He really holds nothing back. So I appreciate that. Key takeaway number 2, your subconscious knows best. You know, I think we've all heard the phrase, we as human beings use 2, maybe 3% of our brains, right? But that's not true. If it was, we wouldn't be alive. The other 97, 98% of our brains is helping us survive. You know, it's beating our hearts. It's helping us remember to breathe. It's growing our fingernails when we're not even paying attention. You know, some people will call this the subconscious part of our brains, right? So Dr. Nelson suggests that in order to figure out if there are any trapped emotions within us, we need to ask our subconscious parts of our brains through muscle testing. And I must confess, I've heard of muscle testing before, but I never really took it very seriously. And there's a few different kinds of tests, self-tests you can do in this book, one of which is called a sway test. And it was just so easy, I couldn't resist trying it. So I kind of, put a bookmarker in the book, and I stood up and I tried the sway test, and I was amazed at not only how easy it was to do, how fast it was, but how accurate it was. So I'm a believer, and I do believe that muscle testing can be incredibly helpful for all of us in many ways, especially when it comes to our health, and especially when it comes to identifying whether or not there are any trapped emotions in our bodies. Now, disclosure here, Dr. Nelson also suggests that we don't necessarily use muscle testing for big decisions in our life. We shouldn't ask our subconscious minds, about winning the lottery next week. It should strictly be used in this context for questions related to our health as to whether or not we do or do not have any trapped emotions. Key takeaway number 3, you choose your emotions. I absolutely love this idea that we can choose our emotions instead of having all this negativity choose us. And Dr. Nelson references Dr. Viktor Frankl. He was a psychologist, Holocaust survivor, and author of one of my favorite books of all time, Man's Search for Meaning. During his horrific experiences across multiple concentration camps, he recognized the fact that when people lost hope, they didn't survive for long. And what was amazing is in the midst of all the horror, there were certain people who somehow, some way chose emotions such as love and hope and giving and caring. And what's incredible is Dr. Frankl concluded that no matter what the circumstance, even if people take away everything you have, they can never take away one thing. And he mentioned that that was the last of our human freedoms, the ability to choose our own attitudes despite the circumstances. So I think that's so powerful that we choose our emotions. Key takeaway number 4, focus on what you want, not what you don't. So how many of us, when we're asked, hey, what do you want? We typically focus and tell people what we don't want. So here we are, focusing on what we don't want, wondering why what we don't want continues to show up in our lives. So this is a real powerful takeaway here, and it's a call to action for us to start shifting our focus into the things that we do want instead of what we don't want. And it reminds me of a story that I heard by Tony Robbins years ago. One day he was driving one of those NASCAR race cars. Is that called driving a NASCAR or a NASCAR race car? I don't know. I don't follow racing, but he was in one of those NASCARs. And he had a driving coach next to him who was helping him navigate the track. And the coach kept reminding Tony to focus on where he wants the car to go. And he warned him, he said, if this car begins to slide and we're approaching the wall, make sure you put your focus on where you want the car to go, because if you focus on the wall, we're going to have a major accident. So it's just a really good reminder to always focus on what we want for ourselves, focus on where we want to go, because when we focus on negativity, it's just going to show up in our lives. What we focus on determines our reality, right? So 5th and finally here, key takeaway 5, I love this one. Life is a learning and purifying process. Dr. Nelson references a really neat story in which there's a women's book club and they're reviewing the book of Malachi from the Old Testament. And these women want to learn more about the process of refining silver. So one of the women identifies a silversmith, joins him one day, and starts asking him a few questions. And she's noticing that he's holding the silver, right in the middle of the fire, where the fire is the hottest. And she thinks to herself, interesting, sometimes God seems to, hold us in some pretty hot spots too, right? He said, do you have to sit there? Do you have to sit there while you're holding that in the fire? And he said, yeah. The silversmith said, not only do I need to sit here, but I also need to keep my eye on it and really pay attention to it, because if I leave it in there for a moment too long, the silver will be damaged. So this woman thought about it for a little while, and then she said, well, how do you know when it's refined? How do you know when it's ready to take out? And the silversmith said, well, gosh, that's really easy. I actually start to see my image in it. So I think that's a really powerful lesson here. If you're going through some difficult times, just trust that you're not alone and God's watching you. Not only is God keeping his eye on you, but know that he has a purpose for you as well. So that's it. Those are my 5 key takeaways from the Emotion Code by Dr. Bradley Nelson. Hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I look forward to seeing you and serving you next week. Take care.